Well, thanks everybody for joining this episode of HITRUST Secrets, where we break down anything anybody has questions on when it comes to high trust compliance or compliance and audit topics in general. So, joined today by my co-host, Donna Nodson, and a frequent visitor, Brian Sedenow. Good to see everybody.
Good to see you too, Susan. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody have any burning questions, anything that came up that wanted to kind of talk about? Nothing.
So, not specifically, but I will put on the agenda if we can get back to it. I attended an ISSA or lunch and learn today, and a really interesting chat around AI and security measures. And I have some thoughts on that it'd be great to get a discussion going on.
Excellent. The only thing I was thinking of, I've gone through and I see it when I create an assessment and I'm looking at the scoping and everything. And one of the things that High Trust talks about is what they call carve-outs. And let me share my screen if I can find it. Where's there? Share. All right. So the High Trust Handbook talks about carve-outs, but it's kind of difficult to really kind of understand. It's like, okay, you can do it, except in an R2, but it doesn't really understand the business reasons why you would do a carve out with an I1 or an E1. And so I'd never know how to respond to somebody when they say, well, should we do a carve out or should we not? To me, if you're relying on a third party, especially if that third party is has gone through a high trust assessment, it sometimes feels better to inherit from them as opposed to doing a carve out. And kind of what does that look like? And how do you frame that to a customer as you go through an assessment when they're like, oh, our vendor does that. Well, yeah, but we can't say our vendor does it because we've carved that out. So, any thoughts on that?
I don't see it used that much. I mean, the carve out language comes from the AICPA and the SOC 2 world. Um, but I tend to agree with you and High Trust in this case that carving out third parties doesn't make sense in the High Trust sort of framework.
Okay. Yeah, the only thing I could think of is if their security is so bad, but would you really want to admit that? That, this vendor, their security is so bad and they have no controls and I can't, that I can't rely on a SOC 2 report. And I don't know how High Trust makes the determination. Maybe we'll have Ryan Patrick or somebody from High Trust at some point come on and say, well, how do they make the determination that this is an acceptable carve out and this is not? And what kind of guidance they give for that?
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen in the past is when um, vendors have security assessments that have fallen short on specific controls, and something extra has had to be put in place in order to manage or mitigate that situation. And it usually goes beyond one assessment. So it's a situation of, this vendor, for whatever reason, consistently falls short, maybe in one particular area, but they are a long-term partner or they deliver something that really crafted, a rather unique relationship. And so it's worth it to continue with that vendor. Sometimes there are conversations going on in the background for them to improve, but those are the situations I've really seen where it's a yes, they have. And I've even seen it with high trust where and this was the case with Microsoft. So, you're not really going to move away from Microsoft, but Microsoft fell short on a couple of controls that were impeding the overall maturity in a domain, not exclusively on Microsoft, but the couple of controls that they had actually ended up as corrective action plans
Hmm.
for the organization I was working with. And that's a situation where it's really difficult. You can't, it's hard to walk away from Microsoft or
Right.
a major platform provider, a cloud service provider. So in those cases, it has to be on the shoulders of the entity seeking certification to say, right, here's where we're going to go an extra bit, do an extra mile. And it is good to have those types of things in mind as you go through. If you have a vendor who falls short in one area, what's your backup plan? Because every organization should have a backup plan.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny because reading the language here, it talks about how you can't pick and choose. It's not like you can say, well, I've got Microsoft, and so for the most of it, I'm going to inherit controls. It's kind of like if you decide to carve out that vendor, you can't use them for anything in the
Hmm.
assessment, which again, I kind of look at it and go, well, I don't know how that works in the practical world because I can't, if especially if it's looking at physical security and I've got everything in a cloud hosted environment. Well, how exactly am I going to be able to say I do this and somebody can audit that when it's all in the cloud, but I've carved them out? So that's, I guess, that's where I kind of look at needing more information about what that business case would be, where it would be a better option to carve out versus kind of the situation that you were talking about where you're just like, yeah, I'm gonna just take that cap and it's gonna be part of my report because it's part of my vendor's report. And I'm just going to have that conversation with them to say the next time you do your high trust assessment, has that been corrected?
Yeah, agreed. Again, in situations where you're working with a vendor to the likes of Microsoft, not every client has the ability to influence, let's say.
Exactly.
And while surely a number of customers or clients would be interested in improvements in that area, each of those organizations is responsible for doing that on their own.
Mhm.
So, it is important to be heads up about that and say, right, okay, well, if they've not had an improvement, what's our plan to
Right.
just mitigate that risk?
Right. Or move to a different provider for it. It would be the other option. Although, unless you're huge, Microsoft's going to be like, okay, hate to see you go.
Right. I
Sorry that
mean,
you're leaving, but
yeah, and oftentimes that's whenever you're talking about an organization that has established an established relationship with whether it's Microsoft or AWS or any of those major providers, to shift away over one control is
Mhm.
just not practical.
Right.
And so the more pragmatic approach is to figure out how, what things you can put in place to demonstrate that you have sufficient controls in-house to manage whatever the shortfall is.
Yeah. And I think at that point, I would probably reduce the percentage of inheritance that I'm getting for that one control and then
Mhm.
show how we're mitigating it or how we're managing around whatever that shortfall is. Because yes,
Yeah.
maybe that cloud provider isn't doing it, but we've got another place, something in place. So our inheritance from that isn't going to be 90% or 100%, or maybe
Right.
back that off to 50% because we're also including something else that's going to also help mitigate whatever that particular gap or cap is.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, that's all I had for high trust. Just a quick update on that interim assessment that I'm doing where we had to add some additional controls. We verified exactly what those controls are, opened a ticket with high trust, which apparently you can't do through chat. You still have to send the ticket to support@hightrustalliance.net, which was helpful because I had the spreadsheet of what I needed to have added anyway. So added that and still in limbo. The QA or the compliance team at High Trust is looking at the requirements that we're saying need to be put in.
Hmm.
And I guess as soon as they approve them, I'm assuming they'll add them, but I'll keep everybody posted on what that process is. Because that's the first time for me ever having to add controls to an interim assessment. And I'll do like maybe a mini course on that at some point. We'll put a little
Yeah.
highlight reel in as
That would be
the
great. And just to clarify for anybody who didn't catch the background on that, the reason that you had to do that was because your client had some fundamental changes that resulted in either areas of the platform or the in-scope systems that
right.
that changed to the extent that high trust required a reevaluation of specific controls.
Correct. Yeah, the underlying location where they're hosting these systems is not adding new systems because you can't do that in an interim, but it was the underlying infrastructure had been moved from one place to another. So the physical security controls, the network controls, and some of those contracts have to be reviewed now because it's a different vendor and a
Mhm.
different operating environment. But yeah, the scope, the systems can't change, but kind of where they're operating from would change. And it would be similar if you had, I could imagine, a completely different reshuffling or reorganization of your information security team that you would want to highlight that and say, yes, we restructured, we moved from reporting here to reporting here in the organization, just so that
Mhm.
those, and then you'd have to look at that with your validated assessor to look at what controls would need to be reevaluated.
Mhm. And I would oftentimes encourage clients who have those types of changes coming to specifically time them around their assessments and interims. If you know you need to make that change, do you have to make it 2 months before your interim? Or can you actually wait
Mhm.
until after your interim is submitted? Doesn't have to be my much, maybe a month. And then you make those changes. You put in immediately all of the adjusted, changes for policies and procedures. These are things that you can get, in draft, ready to go. Everybody's kind of reviewed, pre-approved, and then you can implement them well within, advance notice of the, following assessment, and you're all buttoned up and ready to go.
Mhm.
So I think sometimes people get a little bit anxious and they feel like they can't stop a change that's coming. But I would encourage people to think about if that change has to go right now, or if a deviation of a couple of months would make a really big deal structurally.
Mhm.
You can have somebody be an interim CISO or CIO or whatever it is you need, and then put the changes to that organizational structure in just a smidge after that interim assessment.
Mhm.
And that's often a much more favorable way to
Right,
approach
because it's
evidence and
going
everything else.
right because it's going to be evaluated the following year when you re-up
Yes,
and do your full
yes,
assessment anyway. So it's not like you're
yes,
losing ground. It's just you're like to your
right.
point, you're timing it to say, look, nothing's changed as of this one year, but
Hmm.
you know, changes are coming and kind of and it's also I think helpful to describe that if you know changes are coming, even if they're not implemented as
Hmm.
of your interim, to describe that with your validated assessor and use that interim time period because maybe you don't need new controls to be evaluated, but your assessor can help guide you to prepare to make sure that you've got everything in place to your point. What policies or procedures have changed. You go back and look at your charter and make sure that that times out with the changes so that you're not 2 months later going, oh, that's right, we got to do the charter. And, then you're missing maybe your 60-day window of starting your
Hmm.
next assessment.
Right. And there are also things that you can do looking ahead to that next assessment, where if you know that the organization is going to make changes or considering making changes, carve those out. If you know that your business is changing and growing to the extent that you might have to use or engage contractors in a different way, you might be changing your geographic presence, you might be changing, you're considering e-commerce as an opportunity for the future. You don't have to wait until you get there.
Hmm.
You can absolutely put in place policies, maybe some light procedures. I call them light because if you don't have them yet, you'd have to
Right.
hedge them with,
Exactly.
if this becomes, then these things should be done. But you can get ahead of that a bit and engage your assessors,
Hmm.
right? They're wonderful, wonderful resources. So make sure you have a great relationship with your assessors. And if you need to schedule an interim consultation, do that. It's really helpful. They go through this all the time, and you can say, look, we're thinking about this. Don't get on the back foot. Don't do it after the fact, and you've missed a step or you're not buttoned up the way you should be. Say you're thinking about it. If you're sitting on the governance committee or the security council, I've sat on both of these, and you can hear the conversations about, right, okay, we're considering this. These are our options with regards to this move. Go to the assessor, talk about that in a proactive, future potential state, and you can see what you need to do. And then you can choose those extra controls, you get everything lined up, you go through the next assessment, and you're ready to go. I did this and was in a conversation with the governance committee in one of my roles. And they said, well, this could impact our HITRUST assessment. And I said, actually, it won't. I said, and here's why. I said, these are things that we have been talking about for some time, and these are the controls that we pulled in. I did an assessment. It wasn't a big deviation in terms of the number of controls and what we needed to do. So we've done that. It was included in our last assessment, and we're ready to go.
Nice.
This is where risk and security management really effectively can be an actual competitive advantage if you're using it correctly, if you get ahead of where your teams are, and you're not just reacting to what is, but you're in fact planning for what could be or what will be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think your validated assessor will appreciate not walking into something that looks different than it did a year ago or 2 years ago, where they're all of a sudden going, wait, I thought that person did that. And you're, oh, yeah, it all changed. And it helps with the assessor knowing what new things have happened in the HITRUST MyCSF versions, especially with all of the adaptive controls and the new threats that are coming out and everything that HITRUST is looking at. An assessment feels differently 2 years later. And what you had been assessed on, and even some of the controls that you were it was just eating your lunch. Maybe, hopefully, those have gone away, but they may be replaced with new ones that are eating your breakfast. There's some that you're like, oh man, we're starting with this already. But they can help you kind of understand if you have those check-in times with them to say, oh, this is coming. This is something that we've seen other entities of your size or type struggle with. Make sure you've got this ready to go. That's what I love about the trust report that HITRUST puts out, the top 10 controls that are catching people and what we can do to fix those. So, and your assessor's living that because they're getting tripped up at other, or they're seeing their clients get tripped up in other assessments. So I think that's also very helpful to have those check-ins.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Well, great. So, Donna, did you want to talk about the ISSA meeting that you went to with
sure.
AI and continue on a discussion of more AI? That last week that we had, the last session that we had with Scott Wiener and that AI, I'm just starting to read some of the books that he had talked about. And so I'm going to scare myself silly. I'll probably over in the corner hiding by next week when I finish them. But I think it's a hot topic and it's good that everybody's talking about it. So what kind of insights did they have?
Sure. So, one of the things we were talking about a range of different elements, specifically around AI, and, it isn't going anywhere. So anybody who's not on the boat yet, welcome aboard. It's here. It's not going anywhere. It's like trying to stop cars when, horse-drawn carriages were still out there. It's not going to stop. So best foot forward and figure out how not to attach the horses to the car. It doesn't work that way. So, you need to figure out how AI can and will be used in your organization, and then evaluate where the risks are, right? Identifying risks isn't a bad thing. It gives you the opportunity to say, right, how are we going to manage that? Okay. People see risks and they're like, oh, do we have to talk about the risks? Well, you can bury your head in the sand, but it's not usually a good plan. So talking about the risks, listing them out, one of my clients is a law firm. And I work with them and, where they're using AI for a range of different things. I've been able to guide and suggest things to help navigate, right, where is client data being used? And is this an internal AI, login restricted, the contents of which will only be available in the firm and not something that's a public AI, right? You want to restrict those. You need to put the guideposts on, or the guardrails, as is a phrase very often used in the realm of AI. But those are the types of things that are important. Any organization, AI can be used, as we were discussing last week, in the educational forum, in law, law firms, going all the way through to major tech firms. They were talking today about vibe coding and how AI is enabling development work to move at Mach speeds that they haven't seen before. And how is security, going to keep up with that? And, one of the suggestions was, well, how do we convince, the leadership to hire a lot more security people? And I'm thinking, this is not quite the right way to think about it. It's not that you need more people, it's that you need to change the skill set and evolve the people that you have so that they're approaching it differently. You can't use this is one of the things that popped into my head. So AI is a little bit like deep sea fishing. We've seen the deadliest catch and all that. You can't use lifeguards that are used to a community pool to help out in situations where you're off in the North Sea someplace or off the coast of Alaska. You're now talking about the Coast Guard. It's a whole different playing field, and you need to muscle up accordingly. You can't continue to pretend it's a community pool when, first of all, that's not where your competitors are. That's not where you're going to get the competitive advantage, and it's not where you're going to be able to actually deliver going forward. So you've just got to switch the mindset entirely. And where they were struggling with, well, how do we hire more security people? I posed the question and I said, it seems like what we really need to do is maybe change how developers and how software engineers are actually operating and what their area of expertise, and they're spreading out security across the organization. It can be led by one team, but it can't be all done by one team. And this goes back to what HITRUST regularly promotes, which is don't do HITRUST like a checklist. It is a way of life. It's a way of operating from soup to nuts.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have it thought about and considered at every step of the process. So let's play this out in the software development lifecycle. If they're using AI for coding, can they then change to also use AI, maybe not the same pool of AI, to make sure it's kind of protected and tested appropriately. But in the testing realm, step up the pen tests, step up the guardrails that test that volume of new code. You want to make sure that you are doing even more testing, that it is part of your daily life for evaluating that new code and really keeping pace with potential challenges. And doing a pen test once a year is probably not going to be sufficient if you're churning out code at new volumes that you've never done before. Mm-hmm. So those are some of my thoughts on this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts or hear how you've seen this play out for good, bad, or otherwise.
I don't have a lot, from the assessor standpoint. We're still watching kind of slow adoption of the HITRUST AI validation piece. Personally, as the assessor, I try not to get into people's business needs. I see AI used in a lot of places where I don't think there's a business need for it, but that's never my call. Sometimes I think people are playing with it rather than using it, and they haven't thought about it. But again, as an assessor, I never try to get into the business needs. Your business needs are your business. I just need to make sure they're aligning with the framework appropriately. So I don't have a lot of thoughts in particular. I need to get some more of the assessments under my belt before I really have a feel for how HITRUST is handling it. And in the AI, just in general, I'm still trying to figure out where it fits into my world as an assessor.
So I've got a question. So can you or has your organization considered using AI as part of the assessment? Not to necessarily do the evaluation part, but to do a lot of the administrative, like what are the lists of potential evidence components for this control? How can we show that? I've got one client who uses summary sheets, and lo and behold, I saved a dozen hours at least by, running a spreadsheet through AI and generating an entire zip file of individual Word documents that are, summary sheets. And yes, we had to go in, review, and add a little bit to each one. But the setup alone was a massive difference. And that, I enjoy being able to use AI and save my clients time and money. And, I know that a lot of the assessor firms are oftentimes pushed quite close, on the margins, especially if they've got a client who is a handful. We've all had them.
A
And,
few.
sometimes they need a lot more attention, and that can really pull at margins and profitability.
There's uses for it, I'm finding, as an assessor, but my first hesitation is always, what am I exposing somebody else's data to?
Mm-hmm.
And so, handing things off to the AI is always questionable that way. I do find there's busy work applications for it, especially when I get somebody who's got the whole information security packet. They don't have a password policy in a physical. They have the whole packet. I like to let AI run through it and tell me, okay, where are the password policies, and give me just those.
Mm-hmm.
It does a great job kind of parsing the things that don't have real security implications.
Mm-hmm.
I will use it for that, and assessment here and there, but I'm very kind of tools phobic, and probably that's just my age and whatever else. People use Vanta or Drata or whatever, and I always go double check those because I don't trust those tools. And
Mm-hmm.
it ends up being the same thing as an assessor. I think my natural skeptical nature, it tells me, yeah, the SOC 2 report says this, and I'll go open it up and make sure it does, because I just
Mm-hmm.
get way too many hallucinations to have any comfort level.
Yeah. And I completely agree that AI needs to be double checked. I mean, I asked AI to create an image the other day with 7 key data points, and it delivered a visual that was a really cool visual with 6 data points. And it just skipped one entirely. It skipped number six.
Yeah.
It numbered them. It numbered 1 through 5 and 7 and skipped six. That's a good thing. I
It got
checked the
tired.
work. Because that, it definitely didn't, and I said, that's terrible. You missed one. And the AI came back and said, oh, so I did.
Yep. It's
Cheeky.
nice to win an
So,
argument with AI, isn't it?
Well, I guess then I wonder if the second prompt could be, hey, could you go back and make sure you didn't miss anything? Because
mhm,
what I don't want to be is in a loop where I'm prompting AI to do it and then doing it again anyway. So it feels like it almost may take longer. But
yeah,
maybe these models, as they get more advanced, you can say, oh, go double check your work and make sure that you did it.
right,
Almost like you would, an elementary school kid and be like, are you sure you
right,
finished all your math homework? Can you go check and
yeah.
make sure you got all those problems that you were assigned? And maybe do the same with the prompts.
Yeah, but for clarity, the amount of legwork, like it's a visual I could not have possibly created. It would have taken a digital artist, you know, probably a couple of hours to create or even concept what came back. So that part was good. I plugged the visual back in. I'm like, fix it, and
Right.
it did. But that's where the human involvement, I don't think, can go away. You still have to look at it and say, does it make sense? It's the same thing even with bank statements and stuff. We've been digital banking for years. Doesn't mean there are no mistakes on it or that something hasn't, disrupted the engine. And I think if we go way back, there were probably loads of mistakes, when it first happened. So always be
Mhm.
diligent about whatever solution you're using. And but there is a lot to be gained from it. And so I'm always looking, Brian, I hear what you're saying about, are we plugging in data and that sort of thing, which is why I use it for some things and not when it gets into, this is controlled data, this is sensitive data, this is data that is in any way subject to controls. Like those are things that just, it's uncomfortable. Word document summary setup, easy peasy. That seems very straightforward from where I'm sitting, and just looking at things that save a volume of time, whether it's like, okay, set up this new template, parse this data across these documents, that type of thing. I'm sure those are very basic uses for AI, but I think we can go further so quickly.
Well, I know one of the things I've done because I'm not good with network diagrams and all of that. And, obviously I don't want to put a customer's network diagram into
Mm,
that. But what I
yeah.
can do is I can ask ChatGPT to render me a network diagram that would have all of these components in it. And then I can
Hmm.
compare what it renders to what the client has provided and say, hey, are there firewalls that are missing? Are there, certain places? Because, and then I can even query it and say, well, why did you put that that, firewall or router or whatever in that
Hmm.
spot. And then I can have
Hmm.
a more intelligent conversation with the client because maybe, there's something that they're maybe overdoing or they're not doing enough of, and I can have a
Hmm.
better, more comprehensive conversation with them, even though I'm not a network expert, and kind of move
Yeah.
it. I kind of did that. One of my clients came up and said, well, we've got this gap and I know, they're a Microsoft shop. And so I was like, I get it. So I just went to ChatGPT and I said, okay, if you were going to do this in a Microsoft environment, what Microsoft intrinsic tools would be available to do this? And it
Hmm.
came back and said, oh, you could use Defender or Purview, whatever it was, and came back with that. So then I can have that conversation and say, well, this will be an easy one. This will be an easy hurdle to get over because we can use this tool. Because I don't
Yeah.
remember Purview to Entrada to Intune to, Defender. They're all kind of, it's like AWS and how they have, EC2 and things like that. They just didn't name things the way I'm accustomed to having them named. But this way I
Yeah.
can have that right nomenclature going back to them and not going, is it an S3 bucket or an EC2? And so I can't remember. And this way I've kind of got my little helper saying, no, it's an S3 bucket. Okay, great. Yeah, I remembered that now, and I don't have to be that resident expert, but I can still guide them into having the proper conversations with their network experts or their
Hmm.
infrastructure experts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got one other thing, unless anybody else has AI bets they want to chime in on. Um, who uses Microsoft 365?
I do.
Yeah, me too. I think a good cross section of companies do. Has anybody used Direct Send? I
No.
have not.
Mm-mm.
So they always do some sort of a patch update at the ISSA, and today's was about the direct send is apparently a feature in Microsoft 365 that is automatically turned on by default. And there's recently a phishing campaign. Now, the challenge is that direct send can bypass, I'm reading the notes that I took, the exchange protection online, the EPO, and get in and start sending things from inside. So just a heads up, I don't have the technical details on direct send, but certainly I use Microsoft 365, so it will be something that I'm checking out later today, and making sure my clients are aware, um, because that's concerning where it can pop in and look like, member of the leadership team. It's bypassing the key security measures that would be required for somebody to send an email from, the main part of the email exchange. Um, so I just wanted to throw that out there in case anybody else is in a position to review and double check.
Well, that's helpful. Yeah, I don't,
Yeah.
I'm like more like an end user of it than an administrator of it. But yeah, that is important for clients that may be affected by that.
Yeah, I'll be checking mine and passing along to IT folks. Brian, jump in. You looked like you were going to say something.
I just said thank you. I hadn't seen that one, and I have to use everything because my clients use everything. I
Hmm.
can't say, I can't not take Word documents as evidence. So
Right.
it's hard to say what I do use because I have to be able to open everything that shows up.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Now, talk to me, Donna, about next week. We have a special guest coming
2 weeks on
2
the
weeks from now.
31st.
31st. Okay.
And I've actually got this. I've got the invite ready to go.
Okay.
So this is something we've got Matt Berther, who is going to be speaking on high trust after the confetti, keeping the program quiet, visible, and painless. So I think that'll be really interesting. It's basically he's going to be talking about the benefits of implementing a single pane of glass, as he calls it, to support a streamlined audit cycle. So
So kind of that continuous monitoring after the fact to just kind of have and I know a client that I work with does a very similar. We have the things that High Trust is looking for annually and
mhm,
quarterly and things. And so as you go through the assessment, you go, oh, okay, the last time you did this user access review was this quarter. So now I'm going to
mhm,
make sure that I proactively ping you to say, hey, that next quarter user access review is coming up. Make sure you do it. Make sure you evidence it so that when
mhm.
we get 3 quarters through and we're starting up our next high trust assessment, it's very easy to say, oh, okay, I've got my June, I've got my September, I've got my December, I'm all set. And it's
Yeah.
not a surprise of, oh, that's right, I've got to go back. So that's
Yes.
definitely a very helpful thing to help lessen that friction of your next high trust assessment at
Yeah.
home.
And and I think that's especially important for smaller organizations that tend to have a little bit less formality around their whether it's meeting minutes or key decisions or agendas and that sort of thing. If you can I always go back to SharePoint because almost every organization has it and it's not used nearly to the extent that it could be. But, put a page out there. If you have a governance committee that's 3 people and you meet once a quarter, fine. But put your agenda out there, put your minutes out there. It doesn't have to be super, super formal. We're talking about Word documents. I would suggest converting to a PDF so that they are demonstrated as static. They can't be changed or, whatever updated after the fact, but use that as, a way of demonstrating that formality, collecting that evidence ahead of time. And then you've got the page that here's where everything is.
Right.
And, when the assessors pick out their, here we want to see it from these different weeks or these different dates or these different months, you've got it all right there. And
Right.
it's just easier than going back through emails and things. I'm going to bring it back to where we were talking about risk at the very beginning, which is not documenting risk is only at the disadvantage of the organization because one person may have in their mind what they're going to do if a certain risk happens. And if they win the lottery or, something not so nice, and they're not available anymore to have that conversation with, and it
Right.
all goes belly up, then, what was the plan? Oh,
Right.
nobody
And
knows.
in some
So and
cases,
so
you might
knew, but
forget. I
he's
mean,
not here anymore.
I have great ideas, and then a week later, I'm like, what was that great idea I was gonna? What was that big plan I had for doing that?
Every day of my life.
So unless you have somebody there documenting it and then organizing it in a way you can
Yeah.
back retrieve it, it's kind of
Yeah.
that old adage of, if you've gone through an experience but you don't remember it, have you really gone through it? Because you're having to relearn it when the next time you go through that experience. And that's kind of the same thing. It's, yeah, maybe one person has a great idea, but if they don't write it down or they don't have it in a place where they can retrieve it, even if they're there, they're gonna be like, oh, this, what was I gonna do when that happened? You know,
Hmm. Yeah.
so
And even if 2 people know, because if the CIO is drinking buddies with your CISO or your head of information security, and it all goes wrong one night, it's not a good plan for only the two of them to know. And I say this based on personal experience. You have to make sure that those things are documented. I had to pull strings, for all of the information security documentation to be centralized. And the protests were, well, not everybody should have access. I said, no problem. We can absolutely password protect your information and restrict it to just the users on your team. But by putting it in the central repository with all of the other policies and procedures, we know where they are.
mhm.
And if somebody who's not on your team for some extreme reason needs access to them, then we have a process to go and get them access by means of our standard IT procedures to do that. And it should be probably well known in that circumstance why that, you know, why we
Right.
need to gain access to those things in this unusual moment.
Right.
But at least you know where they are. If they are on somebody's, you know, private drive or buried in a folder, which two people know about, good luck. I mean, that's going to be a really hard situation to recover from.
Exactly. Yep, absolutely.
All right. Well,
All right.
thanks everybody for joining this week.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And we'll talk soon.
Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. If you got value from this episode, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next HITRUST Secrets. We go live every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central and dig into real-world compliance and security topics. And each session gets uploaded right here after the live show. So whether you're catching us live or on your own time, make sure you're subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your HITRUST journey.